What if I told you that one of the biggest predictors of a sprained ankle in ballet isn't weak ankles and it isn't poor technique, but it's actually your brain? In a recent research study, professional dancers said something striking. One dancer literally describes a sprained ankle as the biggest sign of mental fatigue. Today, we're diving into the science behind that idea and what it means for dancers, teachers, and really anyone who moves. I'm Caroline Simpkins. I'm a former professional ballerina with a PhD in biomechanics, and today we're looking at the science behind mental fatigue in ballet. Let's start with what mental fatigue actually is. Mental fatigue is not just feeling tired. It's a state caused by prolonged cognitive effort, things like concentrating, learning, decision-making, and maintaining focus for long periods of time. It shows up as reduced attention, slower thinking, increased perception of effort, and even emotional changes. What's really interesting is that research suggests fatigue is not purely physical. In fact, studies show that even at the point of exhaustion, your muscles still have energy left. That means fatigue is often regulated by the brain, not just the body. Now, when we apply this to ballet, things get really interesting. Professional ballet dancers train for 6 to 8 hours a day, often 6 days a week, and can perform up to 180 shows per year. At the same time, they are constantly learning new choreography, sometimes performing one piece at night while rehearsing something completely different during the day. This study looked at 39 professional ballet dancers and 6 staff members from the Australian Ballet, using interviews and focus groups to understand their personal experience of mental fatigue. And what they found is that ballet isn't just physical, it's physical, cognitive, emotional, and artistic all at once. That combination creates the perfect environment for mental fatigue to develop. So what actually causes mental fatigue in dancers? The biggest factor identified in this study was learning choreography. Dancers consistently described learning new and complex movement as mentally exhausting, especially when the choreography was intricate, fast-paced, or taught over long periods of time. One dancer said the learning process is always the hardest for your brain. And that makes sense because learning choreography requires memory, attention, pattern recognition, musicality, and spatial awareness all at the same time. Another major contributor is sustained focus. Ballet requires continuous attention, watching corrections, staying in sync with others, remembering counts, and maintaining artistry, all without mental breaks. That constant demand on attention drains cognitive resources over time. On top of that, lack of recovery plays a big role. Dancers reported that poor sleep, limited rest, and even nutrition contribute to mental fatigue. Add in the psychological pressure of ballet, things like casting, perfectionism, and constant evaluation, and you have another layer of cognitive and emotional strain. Injury itself also contributes to mental fatigue. Dancers describe the psychological impact of being injured or dancing through pain as mentally exhausting. So you end up with this cycle where injury contributes to mental fatigue and mental fatigue increases the risk of injury. And we'll come back to that because it's one of the most important findings in this study. So what does mental fatigue actually feel like for dancers? One of the biggest themes was emotional changes. Dancers described feeling either overly emotional or completely flat. Some reported increased negativity, while others felt like they didn't have the capacity to react emotionally at all. There were also clear cognitive effects. Dancers talked about forgetting choreography, losing focus, and struggling to learn new material. One dancer described going into rehearsal and simply not being able to recall the steps they had learned the day before. Physically, movements start to feel harder. Dancers reported that everything feels more effortful, like the body is working against them, even if their physical capacity hasn't actually changed. And this brings us to the most important finding of the study. Dancers and staff consistently reported that injury risk is highest when dancers are mentally fatigued. This includes things like sprained ankles and overuse injuries. One dancer even said that a sprained ankle is the biggest sign of mental fatigue. The reason for this is that mental fatigue affects attention, reaction time, decision-making, and motor control. When those systems are compromised, dancers are more likely to mistime a movement, misplace their foot, or lose coordination. And in a high-precision environment like ballet, even a small error can lead to injury. This is actually the first study to explicitly link mental fatigue and injury risk in ballet, which makes it incredibly important for how we think about training and performance. The study also explored what dancers do to manage mental fatigue, and there were some really practical strategies that came up. Psychologically, dancers use things like positive self-talk, breaking choreography into smaller chunks, and pacing themselves during rehearsals. Physically, they rely on rest and recovery, including naps and time away from the studio. Many dancers mentioned the importance of getting outside, spending time in nature, or even gardening as a way to mentally reset. Social strategies were also important, like talking to colleagues, using humor, or simply connecting with others. On the nutrition side, dancers mentioned hydration, snacking, and caffeine as ways to temporarily improve alertness. So why does all of this matter? Because ballet is not just physically demanding. It's cognitively demanding, emotionally demanding, and neurologically demanding. And if we ignore mental fatigue, we're missing a major piece of the puzzle when it comes to performance, learning, and injury prevention. This research gives us a new lens through which to understand why dancers might struggle in rehearsal, why injuries happen, and how we can better support dancers in training and performance environments. Now, it's important to pause here and talk about some limitations. This was a qualitative study, meaning it's based on dancers' perceptions and experiences rather than direct measurement of mental fatigue or injury outcomes. While that gives us really valuable insight into what dancers are feeling, it also means we can't say for certain that mental fatigue causes injury. We can only say that dancers strongly perceive a connection. The study was also conducted within a single professional company, so the findings may not fully generalize to other companies, training environments, or age groups. Additionally, factors like age, sex, and experience weren't specifically analyzed, and the data were collected during the COVID-19 pandemic, which may have influenced stress levels and overall fatigue. So while this research is incredibly important, it really serves as a starting point for future studies that can quantify these relationships more directly. So the next time you feel foggy in rehearsal, emotionally drained, or like choreography just isn't sticking, that's not weakness. That's mental fatigue. And it might be one of the most important signals your body is giving you. If you want to look into this research further, I will include the full citation and a link to the article in the show notes. Thank you to the authors for their wonderful work on this important topic. Thank you for joining me today for the Ballet Science Podcast. Whether you are a dancer, teacher, student, or simply curious about the mechanics behind movement, I appreciate you being here today. Each week, we'll explore the intersection of science and ballet, from injury prevention and biomechanics to nutrition, mindset, and everything in between. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow this podcast, leave a review, and share it with your friends and dance community. If there are specific topics you'd like to hear about in future episodes, feel free to share them in the comments below. You can also follow Ballet Science on social media and visit our website at ballet.science for additional information. Thank you again for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Ballet Science Podcast.